Good evening and welcome to this discussion on the contours of fiscal stimulus, economic policy in the age of Corona. And I have a special guest with me, Mr. Jayant Sinha, who really needs no introduction. He has been, a well-known name in the world of finance even before he handled the finance portfolio. And today he is chairman of the Standing Committee of Parliament on Finance. So COVID-19 has emerged out of left field like the Godzilla monster and smashed the mightiest into cowering submission. We've been seeing reactions all over the world. We've seen, the United States humbled. We've seen the mightiest nations in Europe humbled. We've seen China humbled, and we've seen frightened nation after nation have taken the extraordinary, unprecedented step of locking themselves in, literally shutting down the engines of the economy. Never happened before. And the problem is that the more you shut down the economy, the costs are mounting each day. Now, first of all, I want to have a sense of, if you can tell me, how long do you think this is really going to last? If you start talking of, a fiscal stimulus or economic policy in the age of the corona, do we even have any idea as to how long is this crisis going to last? What is the time frame in which we are really thinking in terms of planning for?
Sanjoy, good evening and wonderful to be with you and to be with all of the folks that are on this seminar. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with all of you. You have correctly identified this as being an extraordinary set of circumstances, unprecedented times, and all because of a microscopic virus that has taken the world and really brought it to its knees. We are confronting a situation that I think happens once in a century. It really is that unusual, and it is not just a black swan event, which typically happens every decade or so, but this is a mega black swan event. The first thing we really need to understand here is how long this massive shock that we are facing is going to last. And how long is it going to take before we get back to normalcy? Now, to understand that, I think there are three sort of medical breakthroughs we need to understand. To really understand what it is doing to the economy, we really have to see what the medical side is doing and what breakthroughs are required there. So the first immediate breakthrough that was required was on testing. And that's largely happened. We can now, with a swab, whether it's a throat swab or a nose swab, we can within 15 minutes tell you whether you're corona positive or negative. So that testing breakthrough has happened, and that gives us an opportunity to really get on top of this situation and apply the best tools of pandemic management to it and epidemiology to it. The second breakthrough that's required is obviously a cure, drugs that will really enable this to be a very manageable disease and something that we can take care of without having to go to hospital. So a variety of different drugs, a variety of different cures are now in clinical trials. And the hope is that in the next 6 months or so, we should be able to find a cure that will take it away from being a deadly disease to being a disease, like malaria or TB that can be managed effectively through drugs. So that's the second aspect. When we find the cure, hopefully in 6 months or so, at that point, I think 80 or 90% of economic activity can come back to normal. There will still be certain things you may not want to do, like a big reception or a big wedding or going to a big sports event. Those kinds of things will still not be advised, but 80 to 90% of the economy will come back to its output levels. Then the third medical breakthrough, which is when we can get to 100% of normal, is obviously when we will have a vaccine. Now, again, there are a host of vaccines that are now in clinical trials, but the time that's required to test a vaccine and scale it up and make it available to a large fraction of the population is at least 18 to 24 months away. So that's really the disease roadmap. Sanjoy, to answer your question, which is how long is this situation going to last? As I said, you have to look at it in three phases: testing, which is done; the cure, which is 6 months or so away; and then, of course, the vaccine, which is 18 to 24 months away. So that's really how long this situation is going to continue till we get back to 100% of whatever the next normal is going to be.
Thank you. I do understand that there is a lot of uncertainty about the time frame which you mentioned, and this is something where we will have to really play along as we learn more and more about it. But coming to the specific topic which we are going to be discussing, which is basically how do you fashion economic policy in this time of uncertainty which COVID confronts us with. The first reports, these are very, very baseline reports coming out from the IMF, which is saying that no, if you assume economic reopening in the second half of 2020, this is just an assumption, you're still seeing 3% contraction in global growth. Advanced economies are going to see as much as a 6 to 9% contraction. Well, there is some cold comfort in the fact that China and India may still see some positive growth. But that is really cold comfort because we're still in an evolving situation where all these numbers may prove too optimistic. And we are all in disaster management mode. So policymakers are today, if you look at the developed world, really willing to junk every rule book and pull out every fiscal, monetary, and financial weapon that they can lay their hands on to throw at this monster. Now, the big question is, if you look at the global scenario, if you're looking at the responses coming out of the large nations, for example, the United States of America or of Europe, uh, they have gone back in many ways to 2008 redux, back to quantitative easing. You were talking today about $3 trillion package. But what are the consequences when you start looking at the larger global system? What are going to be the consequences of these very large quantitative easing measures which are going to be taken?
Yeah, so there's several different things, Sanjoy, that you're alluding to. So let's unpack them one by one. But to understand the magnitude of the shock to the global economy, you've laid out the IMF numbers. The IMF numbers, which are obviously subject to revision, and they often do that, are already saying that if the global financial crisis was minus 0.5% or so, this is going to be minus 3% for the global economy, for global GDP. So those are extraordinary numbers, and that would suggest that what we're looking at is 2 or 3 times potentially the global financial crisis in terms of its economic shock. And why is that? Again, as I said, the timeline is 18 to 24 months. What is going to happen in these 18 to 24 months that's going to create these economic ripple effects? Well, first of all, we are seeing massive demand destruction. For a variety of sectors where there's virtually no consumption at all. Certainly nobody's flying around, or nobody's staying in a hotel right now, nobody's going to restaurants, nobody is a tourist anymore. So there are certain sectors where demand has completely disappeared. There are other sectors like, for example, automotive or consumer durables, where demand is down very sharply, maybe 30, 40, 50%, and will not come back up to the normal levels for a while. And then there are other parts of the economy like the healthcare system, like consumer basics, which actually have seen growth. Netflix, for example, just reported its numbers. It's got 16 million more subscribers in the last quarter. So there is growth happening in certain parts of the economy, but that's not enough to offset the massive shock and the demand destruction. Now, when this kind of demand destruction happens to this much of the economy, you start to see a variety of second order and third order effects as well, which is what we saw in the global financial crisis as well. First, we're going to see a lot of trouble in the financial system globally as well, because many over-levered companies or companies that are financially fragile are going to default. NPAs are going to go up. Equity capital of banks is going to get destroyed. Banks' ability to lend will become far lower. Investors will be very risk averse. They'll not be willing to provide either debt capital or equity capital. So there's a huge sort of second order shock to the financial system as a result of this. Then for many countries, exports are going to go down dramatically because their trading partners are not taking any exports anymore. That's going to create another set of effects. And then what happens is that the weaker countries, and again, we saw that in the global financial crisis, weaker countries like Greece, for example, or Spain or Italy, then start to get into significant financial distress. And that then has a third order impact on the global economy as well. So we are going to see first order, second order, third order impacts on the global economy. And of course, India, which is now tightly connected globally, is also going to experience that. We're going to experience the first order impact of the demand destruction in our economy, then the export channel, the financial system, our trading partners weakening, all of that is going to play itself out in India as well. So this is likely what's going to happen to the global economy. And what's most distressing, Sanjoy, is the human cost of all of this. We obviously are first going to have to ensure a soft landing to soften the human suffering, either in terms of the medical side or in terms of people's job losses and so on. But then after that, we are not going to be able to grow as fast as we had originally anticipated. The job creation may not be as fast as we had thought it would be. So there's a lot of human suffering, human cost also associated, not just with the medical side, but with the economic side as well. And that's going to play out across the global economy and to an extent in India as well.
Thank you. One related question to that, you raised some very interesting points there. After that, we'll come back specifically to India. My question is that, you see, when you had the 2008 crisis, you saw a much more coordinated global response. You had the G7 get together, you had the G20 get together, you had smaller countries get together, and there was a lot of conversation between countries across the world trying to formulate a response to the 2008 crisis. Today, you are seeing every country for itself. Now, what are going to be the implications of that when you start thinking about how do you tackle such a global economic disaster?
Sanjoy, I lived through the global financial crisis because I was in the financial system then and saw it on a day-to-day basis. What happens is, our memories are very selective. The global financial crisis and this corona crisis are actually different in one very important way, which is that in the corona crisis, we are dealing with a set of medical issues and lives are at stake right now. So it's absolutely the right thing for all countries to first focus on the public health and the medical side, make sure that we minimize lives lost and human suffering, as much as possible. We minimize all of that. And that's why we are currently in a phase where everybody's focused inwardly right now. Of course, at the same time, there is still a lot of coordination. Honorable Finance Minister just had a G20 meeting of finance ministers, obviously the Honorable Prime Ministers in a series of extensive international discussions as well. So it's not that global coordination is not happening, but the priorities are domestic right now, which they should. And then, of course, when the time comes for the global coordination, I'm sure that will happen as well. And the reason I'm saying that, as far as the global financial crisis is concerned, we have somewhat selective memories on that is because that played out over almost 2 years. It started in early 2008 and then continued almost till the end of 2009 and so on. And that also, had a phase where people were much more inwardly focused. Then there was global coordination, et cetera, et cetera. But we've, in our minds, in our memories, have compressed those 2 years into a few events that we remember. And so we think it all happened very quickly. Actually, that was not the case. It really was strung out. There was a lot of back and forth. There was a similar set of reactions that we are seeing right now.
So one of our viewers actually wants to know whether, how do you compare this to 1938?
You mean the Great Depression?
Yes, the Great Depression.
Again, no, you really can't compare these episodes in history. I mean, famously, it's been said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And that's why I'm sort of, kind of looking at the global financial crisis, because it taught us a lot. And for us as policymakers, obviously, having gone through it, those lessons are very fresh and clear in our minds. Now, when it comes to the Great Depression, that's the stuff of history books and textbooks. So we haven't lived through it. Obviously, it was an extremely, extremely distressing and destabilizing period of history. And of course, we can talk about all the things that happened, but I'll just make a couple of quick points about the Great Depression. There is a very strong view now that it was very poorly handled as far as policymakers are concerned. There were a lot of policies that were misguided and that accentuated and led to a far worse outcome than it should have. And those of you who've read the book Lords of Finance will know immediately what I'm talking about, but that's an exemplary book to read on the Great Depression. So there were a lot of policy failures as far as the Great Depression is concerned. The second point about the Great Depression I will make is that the economic impact was extraordinary. Global GDP, I think, must have dropped -10, -15%, 25, 30% of people were without a job. and so on. And that brings me to my third point, is that took a long, long time for economies to get out of that. And World War, until it came to the kind of all-out production in World War II for a wartime economy, and then the reconstruction boom that happened in the late 40s, we never really caught up with where the countries were in 1929, 1930. So when you have something of that magnitude compounded by all of these policy failures, the economic and human cost of it is extraordinary. And if you add World War II to it, it's, I just hope we don't go down that path for sure.
Okay, let me come now to India, the way we are battling the crisis and what are the expectations. My question is, how are the responses of a country like India? Are there any constraints there? There's a lot of talk about fiscal packages, a lot of demands being placed upon the government, and there are basically three kinds of calls for help. And each one of them in one way constrains the other. First is the demand that you just loosen the purse strings, print money, the fiscal deficit can go for a six. So give a fiscal stimulus, low interest rates, and so on and so forth. Second is you put cash where it is needed the most urgently, upscaling things like health infrastructure, spending on testing, putting food in the mouths of people, putting cash in their hands. And third, there are states who are at the front line of this all. They have their own demands. They want their ways and means position. Something should be done about that. Grants should be given. The advances to them given. All the cash should be given in advance. So and that fiscal deficit limit should be relaxed. Now these are very, very competing sets of demands. So what do you think? My question would be: what are the constraints? What are the possibilities? What are the options available for fiscal policy, financial policy within India in this scenario?
Well, that's a very wide array of topics, Sanjoy. But first, I will say that the government has handled the public health and the medical side of it in an exemplary fashion. There have been some estimates which say that if the lockdown had not come as early as it had, if there was no lockdown, for example, we would be looking at 8 lakh cases right now. And instead, we have the numbers that we have right now. Also, we have been able to build up our medical facilities very, very quickly. We have lakhs of hospital beds that are ready. We have thousands and thousands of ventilators. We have our frontline workers appropriately equipped with PPE kits. Of course, we can do more, and we can certainly do more, especially on the testing side. But whether it is suppressing and flattening the curve or whether it is getting ready on the medical side, I think the disease management has been absolutely exemplary. It's been absolutely fabulous. So that certainly, I think, has really brought us to a point where we can now look at the economic side and do what's right on the economic side. Because if this thing had spun out of control, we would have had no more resources. We would have been completely consumed by all of that. Now let's come to the economic side. With the public health and the medical side managed as well as it is, we can now look at what, at the level of sort of principles can be considered on the economic side. And of course, there is another economic package that's imminent. Obviously, RBI has already made 2 sets of announcements. Honorable Finance Minister has made 1 set of announcements. So there's already been a fair bit that's been done, but there's still more to come. So we can't get into all the specific details, but 3 or 4 major things do jump out when you look at it. The first thing is that, the policymakers' approach has been very, very carefully sort of sequenced. Whatever was required, right up front has been done, whether it is monetary policy or fiscal policy. And the key sort of areas to intervene, of course, are the rural poor, the urban poor, MSMEs, corporates. And for each of these groups, whatever was immediately required on the monetary side or the fiscal side has been done. And so so the stakeholders have been recognized, and in a sequenced manner, the appropriate policies are being undertaken. The second important point to note here is that the coordination between the fiscal and the monetary side has been excellent. So wherever there was relief required on the monetary side, whether it is in terms of the LTRO operations, whether it's in terms of bringing down the repo rate and the reverse repo rate, whether it is providing regulatory relief on NPAs, loan moratorium, all those have been undertaken by the RBI, while at the same time, the necessary fiscal support that was required, immediately has been also done. Now, of course, there'll be more to come as well. The other thing I think is being handled very well in the sort of policy making is ensuring that the financial system is stable and robust, and unfreezing credit markets, making sure credit markets are working properly. That is also being very thoughtfully done. And finally, I will say that as the policy making evolves, the exit strategy on the lockdown management, the thinking about hotspots, the graduated relief on economic activities, all that also has been done in a very thorough and methodical way as well. So those are the basic contours, those are the basic principles that are driving economic policy making.
A lot of questions are coming to me. We have our audience asking a number of questions, and the biggest concern which is being raised is that India was already, especially the NBFC sector, the banking sector, was in a kind of crisis before this, and the crisis was really as far as NPAs are concerned, as far as the state of credit was concerned, credit was not flowing, and then COVID comes in. So yes, RBI has intervened with some specific measures. But are these measures enough to kickstart lending to the MSME sector, which actually has been hit extremely hard by first of all, what had happened before this and then post-COVID?
I mean, certainly the RBI has made it very clear that they will do whatever it takes. I mean, those are the exact words in RBI Governor Mr. Shaktikanta Das's statement. So he's very, very clear that RBI will do whatever it takes. And there are two very important aspects on credit. There's plenty of liquidity. There's about 7 lakh crores in the reverse repo that's being parked right now by banks with RBI. So we are not short of liquidity, that is, of having cash in the system. What we have to worry about is the other credit markets. And I find people often use these words interchangeably. Liquidity is not the same thing as credit. There is an underwriting process that comes in between liquidity and actually making sure that credit is out there. But we have to make sure that the credit markets are working, and the credit markets are working for everyone, for all types of borrowers, whether they're corporates, whether they're MSME, whether they're retail. Credit markets across the board have to function smoothly and at appropriately low enough rates so that economic activity can flow along. Now, let's take a look at credit markets. At credit markets, with the LTRO operations, the RBI went out and said, we'll ensure that there is sufficient credit available for corporates, and that was, if memory serves me right, 1 lakh crores was provided for those. Then it was observed that even though 1 lakh crores has been put out through the LTRO operations, not enough of it was going into NBFCs. And so another 50,000 crore LTRO tranche was created only for NBFCs. And in addition to that, 50,000 crores was created to provide support to NHB, National Housing Bank, to SIDBI for MSMEs, and to NABARD for agricultural credit. So therefore, as far as the credit markets are concerned, the RBI, by bringing down rates, managing the yield curve, and making funds available for banks to go out and lend, has done what is required as far as credit markets are concerned. Now, obviously, on the fiscal side, I think there will be more to come. Certainly, as far as NPAs are concerned, that regulatory relief has been provided, but there may be more to come on the fiscal side as well.
One observation is that banks in the last few years have been becoming more and more risk averse. Now, how do you get the idea of risk back into banking? That is the only thing that really starts banks to lend again. RBI has taken a lot of measures, but as you said, liquidity is not necessarily credit. Now, how do the credit lines open up? How does banking behavior, which actually has in many ways becoming extremely conservative, where retail lending is preferred to any other kinds of lending, risk lending, project lending, banks are very scared of putting money into. So they become very hesitant about it. Now, how do we get them back to lending to maybe companies which are maybe BBB, triple Bs, or something else? How does that process start?
There's no one thing that can be done. There's not one silver bullet. There's a package of things that have to be done. And I think many of those RBI is doing. Number one, they're bringing down their repo and the reverse repo rate. So it's making it cheaper to actually lend, number one. Number two, they are providing support. They're providing liquidity through the LTRO operation. So they're doing that as well. Number three, by reducing the reverse repo rate and creating a disincentive for banks to park their excess liquidity with the RBI, forcing them to think about lending. That's a third thing that they've done. If memory serves right, I haven't looked at it in detail, but it seems that the LTRO operations, particularly for MSMEs, are going to be used against the priority sector lending target. So they made that also an incentive to go out and do this to provide credit. But at the end of the day, and of course, there's more that can be done from a fiscal point of view through credit loss guarantees and so on that government can do. And some of them have already been undertaken, some of these measures. But at the end of the day, it has to be a discussion between the lender and the borrower. That's the credit function. That's the credit underwriting process. Government has a role to play in terms of policy to take down policy risk, to reduce uncertainty, reduce unpredictability, et cetera, et cetera. Those are important things that have to be done on the policy side. But in a market economy, there has to be a decision between the lender and the borrower that, yes, I have priced credit risk properly, and therefore I can provide you the credit that you require. And so that underwriting function has to be kept strong and robust. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with another wave of NPAs. And so we have to take that into account as well. There's a whole host of things that have to be done. But at the end of the day, the risk assessment and the underwriting is a very core function that you have to maintain the integrity of that.
Now, estimates are that 80 to 90% of India's economy is in the informal sector. And the informal sector has actually been hit very hard. One part is, of course, the finance part, but then the other part is employment. That there is an employment crisis which is happening out there in the MSME sector. We've seen it in the number of migrants who got stranded in various places. And in some way, is it true that the whole question of migrant labor somehow, I'm not saying that it is this government, but somehow because of the nature of migrant labor, it has been a kind of blind spot in India's policy planning. Is that going to change?
Well, Sanjay, let me just correct you on a fact that you laid out, which is you said that 80 or 90% of India's GDP is in the informal sector. I think what you actually meant to say was 80% of India's employment is
employment.
Again, we'll have to look at the exact numbers, but yes, we have a very large informal workforce. Some estimates are 70 to 80% is the informal workforce. And certainly, it's very important to formalize this workforce to ensure that they get benefits, to ensure that they're paid in a stable way. Those are all very important, that the formalization of the informal workforce. But it's not right to say that there aren't a lot of mechanisms to support them now. There are, in fact, because Jan Dhan, obviously the idea was to ensure that everybody got a bank account, including informal workers. Obviously, the Ujjwala Yojana to get a gas cylinder to every household that didn't have a gas cylinder also was intended for the informal workforce. Certainly, Ayushman Bharat, where everybody who has a BPL card is covered, is also intended for those people. The Atal Pension Yojana, the insurance programs, all of these social welfare programs, this building of this social safety net that our government did in the last 5 or 6 years, those are all intended to be able to support people who are in the informal workforce. And it is in fact precisely because of those very, very historic and very, very praiseworthy steps that in fact today we can put money into people's Jan Dhan accounts. We can ensure that people can go to a PDS store and get their rations and so on. So all that work has really helped us today. But certainly there's a lot more we can do to formalize the informal workforce and ensure that they have a very robust safety net that can protect them, even when you have something as unprecedented as the corona crisis.
Besides, the country's own resources, because any country's own resources, especially in the developing world, there are going to be severe constraints on how much they can do. Now, what do you foresee will be the role of multilateral institutions like the IMF and all the others? You have a lot of countries, number of countries, the last count was 90 or 95 countries, approaching the IMF for bailout packages. Uh, what would be the capacity of the IMF to step in, and to what extent would it be able to step in to help out countries in the emerging world?
No, IMF and World Bank both have and WHO for that matter have a very important role to play, and they are doing it. I mean, on the one hand, they have to stabilize the global financial system, make sure there isn't a run on certain currencies, and certain countries don't get into a situation where they're in absolute meltdown mode. So the stabilization aspect of what the IMF has to do is extremely important, and they will, I'm sure, continue to do that. Then there is a second aspect, which means the IMF and the World Bank work together, which is really providing support for humanitarian and development purposes to some of the worst affected countries. As a number of very astute observers have already pointed out, that the worst is yet to come because the pandemic really hasn't hit some of the more fragile developing economies yet. And so when that happens, we are going to have to provide all of those countries with a tremendous amount of support. And that's where the IMF and the World Bank will be, along with the WHO, will be playing a very, very important role. And hopefully, the reserves that the IMF has, at some count, people say it's about $1 trillion, will really be required then to deal with the situation, because we do face a very problematic outcome where a number of particularly commodity exporting countries that are reliant on oil and so on get hit very, very hard. And so it's a double whammy for them, because obviously there's the corona virus that they're dealing with, and at the same time they're dealing with far lower commodity prices, and that is going to make it very difficult for them to manage their economies. And that's when all these multilateral institutions will be playing an exceptionally important role.
What kind of support would India expect from multilateral institutions like the IMF?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are, again, as I said, in a good situation because we managed the pandemic so well. Now we have to turn our task to the economy and work on the economy also. And for us, because we have the resources, we have obviously the ability to attract foreign capital and all of that. We will less be looking for financial support from the multilateral institutions, but much more importantly, we'll be looking for stabilization support. We want to ensure that global trade, global capital flows, global people flows, all of those are protected and stabilized, because our economy does depend on all of that. I mean, just take remittances, right? India is the country that receives the most remittances of any country in the world, at about $70 or $80 billion a year. So we want to make sure that those kinds of flows continue as they have. So stabilization is the most important assistance that we would require from the multilateral institutions.
So, sir, you've spoken about the IMF, you've spoken about multilateral institutions, you've spoken about what the government is doing. I would now turn to the possibilities that is it just government resources or multilateral institutions which will get us moving again? Or are there ways in which, in the altered scenario, we can get global capital to start working for us, that instead of a flight of capital, which we've seen in many ways because of the crisis, gets reversed and we start again getting global capital to work for us?
Sanjoy, I have already written that this is an incredible opportunity for us to accelerate the building of New India. And we really can take this corona crisis and turn it massively to our advantage. Let me tell you why. First of all, I think with a young population and potentially with a very strong immune system, whether that's because of the BCG vaccine or whatever, our disease burden may be lower than those of other countries. We've handled the pandemic well. We've got a young population that's going to be a lot more sheltered from this. So our disease burden is lower, number one. Number two, a number of important inputs for our economy, oil, interest rates, commodities in general have come down dramatically in price. So we can use that to really build up our economy at a very much lower price. Number three, a lot of the usual issues that are constraints like the fiscal deficit and fiscal spending and so on, those now people think are less important. And so we have an opportunity to really use the fiscal space that we get as a result of that and invest that in our economy. There is another very important factor, which is that people are increasingly looking to build more resilient supply chains, more diversified supply chains, and that gives us an opportunity to attract manufacturing from places like China and bring it to India. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, our Honorable Prime Minister is extremely popular right now. His handling of the crisis has raised his already very high ratings into the stratosphere. I just saw some data yesterday which showed that he is by far the most popular global leader right now, and his credibility is extraordinary. So he has the political capital also, along with the financial capital, if you will, to really go out and accelerate the building of New India. And so this I believe, longer term, is an extraordinary opportunity for India to accelerate its growth and to dramatically improve its relative standing among countries.
You mentioned about the rout in commodity prices, and you also spoke particularly about what is happening to the world of oil. One question, quick question. Today, oil is WTI have entered into the negative domain. Oil prices are very low. Now, there is a fear that as each nation is turning into itself, is the world going to forget about climate concerns, or do you think there are still ways in which we can green the stimulus packages, use this opportunity to direct it in the future towards the frontier sectors which the world is aspiring towards, to have a cleaner environment? And the shutting down the economy has been great for the environment. Now, how do we keep this momentum?
Fantastic question, Sanjoy. And my views on that, which is that I think it's vitally important for India to get to the green frontier. We really have to be on the green frontier. And when I talk about the frontier, I talk about the frontier both in terms of competitiveness, which is we have to have a very competitive, innovative economy. And I talk about it also in terms of sustainability. And sustainability obviously is climate change, it's emissions, it's pollution, it's all of that. But sustainability also we talk about in terms of human capital. Like human capital has to be continuously improved. We have to improve our healthcare infrastructure and so on. But we really need to think about getting to this green frontier. And if today we are dealing with this set of crises around the medical side, the pandemic and everything else, very soon we'll be dealing again with the same set of issues around climate change and the crises associated with climate change. We've got to pause, a breather right now. And this has been a pause that refreshes, if you will, because in this pause, when we back down in terms of economic activity, and right now we are probably in India, maybe some people are calculating 50 or 60% of our normal economic activity. Look what it's done to our skies. Look what it's done to our air. Look what it's done to wildlife. It's extraordinary. I'm in central Delhi and I'm hearing the birds chirping every day, and I'm looking up to a blue sky, and I'm feeling healthier and better because of this. Who would want to lose that going forward? So it's very important for us as we move forward and build this new India, that we build a green and sustainable new India. And that is precisely what we need to do going forward in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our cities, in terms of our energy sector. We've got to take the opportunity that we have right now. And as we build for the future, we have to build resilient green infrastructure, which is what the world wants anyway, and for which we will be able to attract sufficient capital as well. So that is precisely the direction we need to go towards, getting to the green frontier.
Thank you. I think I've exhausted my questions, and there are lots of questions actually which have been coming in my feed. So I won't be able to take up all of them, but let me pick up some from the various ones which I'm seeing before you. One interesting question, which is from Dr. Sanjay Jain, and he's asking, are we going to see, and my question would be, are we going to see this across the world, not just in India, a shift in economic policies? You're seeing a reassertion of the state in many ways. So is socialism going to come back? Are you going to see a larger and larger role for not just the state, but state-owned companies? And is India, because in many ways you have a private sector, MSMEs, various infrastructure sectors are getting wiped out, a greater role for the public sector to step in to do those kinds of investments? Are we seeing a larger state come in and back to a mixed economy, back to a kind of a socialist model?
I think that question is going to differ from country to country. Speaking about India, certainly the state in India, as elsewhere, is playing a very important role right now because we're dealing with public health, which is essentially a public good. And when you deal with public goods, obviously the state is best equipped, best resource to deliver public goods, whether it is health, whether it is education, whether it's clean air, law and order. These are the natural subjects that the state needs to take up and the state needs to provide for. But when it comes to private goods, when it comes to developing a drug, when it comes to developing a vaccine, there you can see that market economies, the private sector is far better equipped to do that than the state. So I think this whole crisis has demonstrated once again the right role for the state, the right role for the market economy, and the two will of course go hand in hand in every country. I don't think anybody's going back to socialism, at least in the developed world. Everybody has tried that and we know it doesn't work. And certainly as far as India is concerned, we also understand that balance well between public goods, private goods, state and the market. And I think, as the Honorable Prime Minister has said many, many times, we want to really encourage our entrepreneurs. We want to encourage our best companies to go out and be super competitive and super innovative.
Now, at least three of our viewers want to know that you've spoken about opportunities for India. Are we looking at a major restructuring of global supply chains? And what can India do to make sure that it takes advantage of the restructuring of supply chains, which is going to take place in the post-COVID world? Does India have in it to kickstart its manufacturing in a way that it gets into, in a big way, in the restructured supply chains?
The answer is that there is a tremendous opportunity in these more resilient supply chains. And it's really up to us to capture that opportunity. And when I say us, that obviously means a collaborative partnership between policymakers, the state, and of course the private sector, and then global multinationals that will want to establish their supply chains in India. Right now, when we compare India and look at where it's positioned, we find that there's a lot we can do to make India more competitive. And certainly those are the things that the government is undertaking. But at the same time, we need our entrepreneurs, our companies to be risk takers, to go out and build businesses, go out and invest money and hire people. And if we do that, as we've done in so many industries, whether it's pharma, automotive, IT services, whatever, I think yes, we'll be a great place for people to establish their operations.
From that, there's another question on supply chain management. That is more an internal question. When we start looking at the easing of the lockdowns and the gradual restarting of the economy, which you spoke about right in the beginning when you started this discussion, a major problem which is even today occurring, and we still have to find a way around it, is supply chain management. That unless the entire supply chain management falls into place, the revival of the economy, of the MSME sector is going to be extremely difficult. And we are seeing a kind of, coordinating this response is going to be extremely difficult because certain areas are going to remain shut down. Decisions are going to be taken many times at local levels, segregated levels. So how does one manage and make sure that supply chains work and the economy can start reviving for many of these sectors?
That's a great question. And of course, the exit strategy from the lockdown is going to disrupt supply chains. It's going to be difficult to make sure that all the pieces are fitting together. That's going to have to be with trial and error over a period of time. So that'll take some time to be able to all come together. But we are living in a very interconnected world where there are extraordinary linkages between all aspects of the supply chain. So if you open a factory and there aren't any hostels outside the factories, then factory workers can't stay there. If there isn't a dhaba that's working outside that hostel, then factory workers are not going to get the services they require. If the dhaba is not getting a supply of sugar or tea, then that's not going to. So, it goes on and on and on. And it's very difficult to figure out, where is it that you say this is essential, this is not essential, or this will happen or this will not happen. So we have to let the market economy figure out all these interconnections. And that's why, any sort of management of that ends up being a fairly blunt instrument. So the quicker we can deal with the medical and the public health issues, the quicker we can lift the lockdown restrictions and the faster we can restart those supply chains. But as I said, that's a trial and error process that will take some time.
We're reaching the end of our time, so I'll just pick out one last question. And this is fundamentally about, we are talking about moving into the future. We are talking about what we can do in the Indian economy. In your view, is this the right time? Would this be the right time to come in with some of the reforms which you could not do in the economy, mainly the large reforms around labor? A lot of people are saying this is the right time. A lot of people say this is not the right time. A lot of reforms around land acquisition and all the others. Is this the right time, or is this not the right time to do these kinds of reforms?
Yeah, I don't know whether I would pick exactly those reforms. I certainly believe that this is an opportunity for us to improve our competitiveness and to strengthen India's position as a manufacturing base, as a services base, and so on. But whatever reforms are undertaken, I'd like to make sure that they are undertaken in a very responsive way, working very closely with industry, so that we can identify exactly what the drivers of competitiveness are, globally benchmark ourselves against the most competitive countries, and try and understand, where is it that we are falling short? I mean, you mentioned land and labor, but I hear capital much more than I hear land and labor. The cost of capital in India is too high, or capital is not available. So maybe it's capital that we have to look at. Maybe there are some regulatory measures that we have to undertake that are more important than land or labor. So whatever the reform processes are, whatever the reform measures are, my hope would be that it would be done in a way that's very consultative, and that puts its finger on exactly those move the needle types of interventions that will genuinely make manufacturing in India or the services in India, very differentiated, very much better than anywhere else in the world.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, spending these 50 minutes with you, having this conversation. And your message has been, yes, it is difficult. We are in a tough place, but eventually there is light at the end of the tunnel, and there are opportunities which can be used if we use them properly in the days ahead. Thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure being with you, and I hope to see you back with us sometime again soon. As the situation evolves, we'd like you to come back and discuss some of these issues again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.